My mother said it the way you'd return a sweater you didn't like. Flat. Final. No raised voice, no slammed door, just 6 words across the dinner table while the gravy was still steaming. You're not serious. Pack your things. I remember staring at the little chip on the edge of her wine glass, the one she'd been meaning to replace for 2 years, and thinking how strange it was that the world could end, and the gravy would still be steaming. I was 23. I had just told them I was leaving med school. My name is Cordelia Vance, but everyone in my family called me Cora, except my mother, who called me Cordelia when she was disappointed and Cordy when she wanted something. That night, she called me Cordelia. The Vances are a medical dynasty in the way old Boston families used to be a medical dynasty. My father, Arthur Vance, is a cardiothoracic surgeon at Mass General. My mother, Eleonora, runs the anesthesiology department at the same hospital. My older brother, Sterling, is in his 3rd year of orthopedic residency. My younger sister, Pippa, was, at that point, a junior in pre-med at Dartmouth, on track to graduate summa cum laude and join the family parade. And then there was me, the middle child, the one who got into Johns Hopkins because of course I did, and was 3 semesters deep before I admitted, even to myself, that I hated it. Not just disliked it. Hated it the way you hate the smell of a hospital after a long week. Hated it the way you hate a song that's been playing in your head for 10 years and you can't make it stop. What I loved was bread. I know how that sounds. I know how it sounded that night when I tried to explain it. I had been baking since I was 9 years old. Ever since my grandmother on my father's side, Nana Marlena, taught me how to feed a sourdough starter from a mason jar in her kitchen in Vermont. I went to college and I baked through finals. I went to med school and I baked through anatomy. I baked through my first cadaver. I baked through the cardiology rotation when my attending told me I had no instinct for the heart. And one Tuesday morning, after pulling a 42-hour shift, I came back to my apartment in Baltimore, stood at the counter, and started crying into a bowl of flour. Not because I was tired, because the bread was the only thing in my life I actually wanted to come back to. I dropped out the next month. I had a plan. I had savings. I had a Pinterest board, which I will admit is not a real plan. But I had a feeling, which is sometimes better. I drove home to Brookline to tell them in person because I thought I owed them that much. I did not. You're not serious. Pack your things. My father didn't even look up from his plate. My mother said it once, set down her fork, and went back to cutting her chicken. Sterling, who had driven down from his residency that weekend specifically because Mom had told him I was coming home for something important, let out a single small laugh through his nose like I'd told a bad joke at a cocktail party. Pippa, my little sister, stared at her water glass with her ears bright red. I sat there for a second and then I said, "Are you serious?" My mother looked up, and the look on her face is something I will never forget for as long as I live. It wasn't anger. Anger I could have worked with. It was the polite, slightly bored expression you give a stranger who has bumped into you on the train. "Cordelia," she said, "we did not raise you to be a hobbyist. Your father and I have been very patient. We've watched you flirt with this little distraction since you were a child. Enough. Bread isn't a distraction. I want to open a bakery. You want to play at being a baker," she said. "There's a difference, and you are not going to do it on our dime, in our house, with our name attached." My father finally looked up. "Cora," he said, and for a second I thought maybe he'd be the one. He'd been the soft one when we were kids, the one who let me put my feet on the coffee table. "If you walk away from your residency placement, we cannot keep funding this. You understand that, don't you? There's no halfway here." I understood. I understood that I was being given a choice that wasn't a choice. Med school or out. The family or the flower. I said, "I'll get my suitcase." I went upstairs. I packed a duffel bag because I didn't actually have a suitcase at the house anymore. My old room had been converted into Mom's meditation room 2 years prior, and most of my stuff was in a plastic bin in the basement. I took what I could carry. A few sweaters. My grandmother's mixing bowl, the heavy ceramic one with the yellow rim, which she had given me on my 18th birthday and which my mother had been displaying as a decorative object on a shelf in the dining room. I unwrapped it from the dried lavender she'd stuffed in it and put it in my bag. When I came down with my duffel, my mother was wiping the counter. She didn't look up. My father was on his phone. Sterling had already left, apparently. Pippa was the only one who walked me to the door. She hugged me. She whispered, "I'm sorry, Cora. and I could feel her shaking, and I wanted to hate her too, but I couldn't. She was 19. She was scared. I held her for a second and I said, "It's okay, Pip. It's okay." Then I left. I sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes because my hands were shaking too hard to drive. I drove to a Motel 6 outside of Worcester because it was the cheapest place I could find on my phone at midnight. And I sat on the polyester bedspread and I cried until my face hurt, and then I did something that I think saved my life. I opened my laptop. I opened a spreadsheet, and I started doing math. I had $11,400 in savings. I had a Toyota Corolla with 170,000 miles. I had a culinary arts certificate from a summer program at the CIA in Hyde Park that I had done 2 summers ago, telling my parents it was a stress hobby. I had a sourdough starter in a glass jar in my cooler in the trunk, which I had named Bartholomew when I was 20, and which had been alive longer than most relationships I'd ever had. I had a sister-in-law named Teresa, Sterling's wife, who had always been kind to me, and who lived in a town called Beaufort, South Carolina, where her family ran a small marina. I had texted Teresa once, 6 months earlier, in a moment of weakness, that I was thinking about leaving Hopkins. She had texted back, "Come visit any time. I mean it." She was the only person who had ever said something like that to me. I texted her at 1 in the morning from the Motel 6. I said, "I think I left. Can I come stay for a little while?" She texted back at 6 a.m. "Doors open. Drive safe." I drove for 14 hours. Beaufort is a small town on the coast of South Carolina, about an hour from Savannah, and when I rolled in that evening, it smelled like salt and pine and somebody's barbecue. And Teresa met me on her porch with a glass of sweet tea and didn't ask me a single question. She had a guest room with a quilt her grandmother had made and a window that looked out at a creek with herons in it. She let me stay for 6 months. I want to be clear about something. I didn't get rich quick. I didn't get rich at all for a long time. The first thing I did, after sleeping for 2 days, was get a job. I worked the morning shift at a coffee shop on Bay Street called the Sandpiper, and the owner, a woman in her 60s named Ms. Geraldine, let me bring in 2 loaves of sourdough on my 3rd day, and she sold them by 9 a.m. And the next day she let me bring 4, and the day after that, 8. By the end of the month, I was baking out of her back kitchen at 4 in the morning before my shift, and she was selling everything I made. Teresa's husband, Sterling, my brother, called me exactly once during this time. It was a month after I left. He said, "Mom wants me to remind you that the offer to come back stands until September." I said, "What offer?" He said, "To re-enroll." I said, "Tell her I quit." He hung up. I didn't hear from any of them for 2 years. 2 years. I want to sit in that for a minute, because I think people skip over it when they hear these stories. 2 years is a long time. 2 years is 24 months of birthdays and Christmases and Easters and Thanksgivings where the phone doesn't ring. 2 years of seeing a missed call from an unknown number and feeling your heart leap before you realize it's a spam call about your car's extended warranty. I cried a lot in the first year. I cried less in the second. By the 3rd year, I didn't cry anymore. By the 3rd year, I was busy. Here's what happened in those 3 years. Year 1, I saved every dollar I made at the Sandpiper, plus the bread money Ms. Geraldine gave me, which was a generous cut. I moved out of Teresa's guest room into a studio apartment above a tackle shop. I started selling at the Saturday farmers market, where I met a woman named Joss, who ran a flower farm and who became my best friend in the world. I named my little operation Bartholomew's Bread, after my starter. I drew the logo on a napkin. I painted it on a piece of plywood. I propped the plywood up on 2 milk crates. Year 2, Joss told me about a tiny commercial space on Carteret Street that was about to come available. It was 900 square feet, formerly a bait shop, and it smelled like it for the first 2 months. I drained my savings, took out a small business loan with Teresa as my co-signer, and signed the lease. I painted the walls myself. I built the shelves myself. Joss helped me put up curtains. We opened Bartholomew's on a Saturday in March. We sold out by 10 a.m. We sold out every day for the next 4 months. Year 3, I hired 2 part-time bakers. I expanded the menu. I started doing wholesale to 3 restaurants in Charleston. A food writer from Garden and Gun came down for a Best of the Lowcountry piece and took my pictures standing in front of a wall of round loaves, flour in my hair, and the picture went viral in that quiet way that food things go viral. On Instagram and on Pinterest, and on a Reddit thread called rbreddit, where people argued about whether my open crumb structure was achievable at altitude. I opened a second location in Bluffton in November of that year. By the following summer, I had 4 locations across the Lowcountry, a wholesale arm that supplied 27 restaurants from Savannah to Charleston, and a small subscription box that shipped sourdough nationally on dry ice. My accountant, a deeply unflappable man named Mr. Ball, Prasad, told me one Tuesday morning that I was on track to gross 7 figures that year. I sat in my car in the parking lot and laughed until I cried. Year 4 was when the offer came. A specialty food conglomerate out of Atlanta, the kind that owns boutique food brands and lets them keep operating semi-independently, reached out through their VP of acquisitions. They had been watching me. They wanted to talk. We talked for 9 months. We negotiated. We renegotiated. They flew me to Atlanta twice. I brought Mr. Prasad and a lawyer named Imani Whitfield, who looked, I am not kidding, exactly like Angela Bassett and was the smartest person I'd ever met in my life. The final offer was $31 million, cash and equity. I would stay on as creative director for 3 years, with full control over recipes, branding, and locations. I would retain 20% of the company. They would handle expansion. I signed the papers on a Thursday in October, 4.5 years after my mother told me to pack my things. The first thing I did was call Teresa. The second thing I did was call Joss. The third thing I did was drive to Ms. Geraldine's house because she had retired by then, and I sat on her porch and I gave her an envelope. And inside the envelope was a check for $250,000 because she had let me bake out of her back kitchen for 9 months and had asked for nothing in return. She tried to give it back. I made her keep it. The fourth thing I did was buy a house. I had been renting a little bungalow in Beaufort for years, but I had been quietly looking for something else. Something for me. Something that said, you are not the girl in the Motel 6 anymore. I found it on a back road outside Bluffton. It was a $3 million property, a low-country estate on 12 acres with live oaks dripping with Spanish moss, a wraparound porch, a guest house, and a tidal creek at the back of the property where the herons came in the morning. It had a stone-paved driveway, not gravel. It had a real kitchen, a serious one, with a 6-burner range and a marble island the size of a small car. It had a guest wing with 3 bedrooms. I closed on it in January. In March, I got an email from my mother. I want to tell you something. I had imagined this email so many times, in so many versions, that when it actually came, I sat at my kitchen island and stared at it for 40 minutes before I opened it. I had imagined it short. I had imagined it angry. I had imagined it long. I had imagined it long. I had imagined it. What I had not imagined was that it would be cheerful. Cordy, sweetheart, it began. Your father and I have been thinking about you so much lately. We saw the most wonderful piece about you in Southern Living, and we are so proud. We had no idea you'd built such a beautiful little business. We'd love to come visit and see you in your new home. Sterling and Teresa are coming down for Easter, and your father and I thought we might join. Pippa too. Let me know what works. With love, Mom. Cordy, sweetheart, beautiful little business. I read it 5 times. Then I called Teresa. She picked up on the second ring. She said, Cora, before you say anything, I had no idea she was emailing you. Sterling told me yesterday. I said, what's going on? Teresa was quiet for a second. Then she said, Cora, I love you, and I'm going to tell you the truth because you deserve it. Your father had a malpractice case go badly last year. A patient died. He settled out of court. The settlement was significant, and there were 2 more cases pending. He's not been operating since November. Your mother took early retirement. They're in trouble, Cora. They're in real trouble. And Sterling has been catching the worst of it because he's the closest and he can't keep doing it. I sat with that for a long time. I said, how much trouble? She said, I don't know exact numbers, but the house in Brookline is on the market. They're moving to a condo. Sterling thinks your mom is hoping you'll help. I said, has she told you that? She said, not in those words. I told Teresa I needed to think. I thought for 3 days. I walked the property. I sat on the porch. I called Joss. I called Imani Whitfield, who had become a real friend, and I told her the whole story. And she listened, and at the end she said, Cora, you don't owe them anything, but you can still see them. Those aren't the same thing. I wrote back to my mother. I said, Mom, you're welcome to visit. Easter weekend works. I have a guest house with 3 bedrooms. Let me know your arrival time and I'll have someone meet you. Cordelia. Not Cordy. Cordelia. They arrived on a Friday afternoon. I had not seen any of them in person in over 4 years. My mother stepped out of the rental car and looked at the house with an expression I cannot fully describe. It was not surprise. It was the careful absence of surprise. Like she had spent the whole drive practicing not being impressed. My father got out next, and he looked older in a way that startled me. He had lost weight. His hair was thinner. He hugged me first, and his hug was longer than I expected, and I let it happen, and I didn't know how I felt about it. Sterling and Teresa got out of the second car. Sterling looked uncomfortable. Teresa looked at me like, here we go. Pippa got out last. Pippa, my baby sister, who I had not seen since she was 19, was now 24 and pregnant. 6 months pregnant. She walked over to me slowly, and she said, "Hi, Cora," and she started crying. And I started crying, and we held each other on my driveway for a full minute while my mother stood there with her purse and pretended to be looking at the live oaks. I had Joss come over to help with dinner that night. I had hired a caterer too, because I refused to do all the cooking myself for people who had told me cooking was a hobby. We ate on the back terrace under the live oaks. Citronella candles, a long table, good wine. My mother complimented the wine 3 times. My father didn't say much. Sterling and Teresa kept the conversation moving. Pippa held my hand under the table for most of dinner. After dessert, my mother set down her wine glass and said, "Cordelia, your father and I were hoping we could have a quiet word." I said, "Of course." The 3 of us walked to the edge of the terrace where there's a little stone overlook of the creek. The moon was on the water. It was a beautiful night. I want to be honest, it was a beautiful night. My father started. "Cora," he said, "I want to apologize." I waited. "We were wrong about you. We were. Your mother and I have talked about it a lot in the last few months. We didn't see what was in front of us, and we acted out of fear, and we should have supported you. I'm sorry." It was a good apology. It was the apology I had wanted for 4.5 years. I should have known what was coming next. My mother picked up where he left off. "Cordy, sweetheart, the thing is, we're at a hard moment. Your father's career, as I'm sure Teresa told you. There have been some setbacks. We've been looking at our options, and we've been looking at properties, and your father and I were thinking if we could find something close to you, something small. Just a little cottage. We could be near family again. We could be here for Pippa's baby. We could start over. And we know it's a lot to ask, but we were hoping. We were hoping you might be able to help. As a loan. Or however you'd like to structure it." There it was. I had practiced this moment in my head, in some form, since the night I sat in the Motel 6. I had imagined the cutting one-liner. I had imagined the cold dismissal. I had imagined turning my back and walking away. What I actually said was this: "Mom, Dad, I appreciate you saying that. I do. And I want to say something back." I took a breath. 4.5 years ago, I told you I wanted to open a bakery, and you told me to pack my things. I drove to a motel in Worcester, and I sat on the bed and I thought my life was over. I had $11,000 to my name. Nobody called me. Nobody checked on me. I built everything you're standing on tonight by myself. Teresa helped me. Joss helped me. Ms. Geraldine helped me. You didn't. My mother started to speak. I held up my hand. "I'm not finished. I'm not going to give you money. Not as a loan, not as a gift, not for a house. And I want you to understand that this isn't about revenge. I'm not angry anymore. I was for a long time, but I'm not anymore. This is about something else. This is about the fact that what you're asking for, what you came here for, is for me to fund the same family that told me my dream was a distraction. And I'm not going to do that. Not because I want to hurt you, because I want to respect myself." I looked at my father. He was looking at the creek. "I love you both. I want a relationship with you, if that's something you want too. I want to know my niece or nephew. I want Timippa in my life. I want all of you in my life as a family, but I'm not your retirement plan, and I'm not your second chance, and I'm not going to apologize for that." My mother was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I see." She turned and walked back to the house. My father stayed. He stood at the railing for a minute, and then he said, "Your grandmother would be proud of you, Cora." I almost lost it then. I almost did. I held it together. I said, "Thanks, Dad." He squeezed my shoulder and went inside. They left the next morning, a day earlier than planned. My mother gave me a brittle hug at the door and said, "Take care of yourself, Cordelia." My father hugged me longer. Sterling and Teresa stayed 2 more days. Pippa stayed a week. I have not given my parents a single dollar. What I did do 6 months later was set up a foundation. It's small. It funds culinary scholarships for first-generation college students from rural Lowcountry families, and it provides microgrants to women starting food businesses in the South. I named it after my grandmother, Marlena. The first 3 grants went out last spring. One of them went to a 22-year-old girl from Walterboro who was starting a pie business out of her mother's kitchen. I cried reading her application. My sister Pippa had a baby boy in August. She named him Sebastian. She drives down to see me with him every other month, and he sleeps in the bassinet in my kitchen while I bake, and she sits at the island and tells me about her life. She finished her degree, but in nutrition, not medicine. She works for a public health nonprofit. Our mother does not love this. Pippa says she's making peace with that. I talk to my father once a month. Short calls. We talk about the weather and the herons. He has not asked me for money again. I don't think he will. I think, in his own quiet way, he understood me on the terrace that night. I haven't spoken to my mother in over a year. Teresa tells me she's doing all right. They sold the Brookline house. They bought a small condo in a suburb. Sterling helps them with what he can. They're going to be okay. They're going to be okay without my money because most people in the world have to be okay without somebody else's money, and they are not, it turns out, an exception to that rule. I'm 31 years old now. I bake almost every morning. The starter, Bartholomew, is 12 years old and lives in a clay crock in my refrigerator. The company has grown beyond me in ways I never imagined. I still have my 20% and my creative director title, but mostly I work on the foundation now and on the new test kitchen I built in the guest house, where I develop recipes for nobody in particular. Someone asked me recently, on a podcast, if I would do it differently if I could, if I would have argued harder that night at the dinner table, if I would have begged. I thought about it for a long time, and I said no. I said, the worst night of my life turned out to be the most important door I ever walked through, and I had to walk through it alone, because that's what doors like that require. And I said that I think about the girl in the Motel 6 sometimes, the one with the shaking hands and a spreadsheet, and I want her to know that it gets better. Not because the people who hurt her come back and apologize. Some of them will, some of them won't. It gets better because she gets better. Because she builds something. Because she finds her people. Because the bread keeps rising. And every morning, when I take the loaves out of the oven and the kitchen smells like the only thing I have ever really wanted, I think about my mother saying, "You're not serious." And I smile, and I get back to work. I've thought about that night at the dinner table more times than I can count. And the strangest thing I've learned is that I'm not angry about it anymore. Not really. Because the truth is, every single thing that happened after my mother told me to pack my things was a direct result of someone making a choice. She made a choice. My father made a choice. I made a choice. And the choices added up, year by year, the way flour and water and time add up into something you can hold in your hands. My mother chose to treat my dream like an embarrassment. That was her choice. And the consequence of that choice was not that I crumbled. The consequence was that I became someone who no longer needed her approval to survive. You cannot complain about losing power over a person you spent years pushing away. That's not how any of it works. The world has its own arithmetic, and the arithmetic is patient, and the arithmetic always adds up in the end. I chose, that night in the Motel 6, to open a spreadsheet instead of an Ambien bottle. That was the most important choice I have ever made in my life. And I want to say something honest about that choice, because I think people who watch stories like mine sometimes get the wrong idea. I was not brave that night. I was terrified. I just decided that being terrified and doing the math were not mutually exclusive. That's all courage really is, in my experience. It's just doing the next small thing while your hands are still shaking. If there's something I would want the girl from Walterboro to know, the one who got our first scholarship, the one starting her pie business out of her mother's kitchen, it's this. Character is not what you do when people are watching. Character is what you do when nobody has called you in 2 years. Character is whether you keep feeding your sourdough starter when there is no shop, no customer, no future, no proof that any of it will matter. I fed Bartholomew through 2 years of silence. I didn't know I was building anything. I was just refusing to let one small living thing die on my watch. Turns out that's a whole philosophy. And the last thing, the thing I wish my younger self had understood. Forgiveness is not the same as funding. You can let go of the anger and still keep your hand on your own wallet. You can love people from across a property line. You can say, I want you in my life, and also, I will not be your insurance policy. And both of those sentences can be true at the same time, and saying them out loud does not make you cruel. It makes you a grown person who has finally learned the difference between being loved and being used. The bread still rises every morning. I still get up at 4. And the kitchen still smells like the only thing I have ever really wanted.